June 4, 1942. At precisely 700 meters above the Pacific Ocean, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched through binoculars as the American carrier decks below erupted in what he initially believed was chaotic panic. Aircraft were being frantically rolled across the flight decks, ordnance crews were sprinting between planes, and fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking like a tangled mess of confusion. Japanese naval officers aboard the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had meticulously timed these rearming procedures during reconnaissance flights, confident that the American Navy's desperate improvisation would prove their undoing. They believed the enemy was caught unprepared, scrambling to respond to the disciplined might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these experienced officers were about to witness would shatter everything they understood about naval aviation, industrial capacity, and the very nature of American military doctrine, revealing not chaos but a calculated efficiency that would reshape the entire Pacific conflict in a single morning. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito had been timing American carrier operations since the early morning hours, his stopwatch clicking with metronomic precision as he documented every movement through his observation scope. He had graduated top of his class from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1935 and had served aboard carriers for 7 years, making him one of the most experienced aviation officers in the combined fleet. His calculations were based on Japanese procedures, which he knew intimately. Rearming a single Type 99 carrier bomber with an 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb required exactly 18 minutes and 40 seconds when performed by a well-trained crew. Refueling the same aircraft added another 12 minutes. Switching between torpedo and bomb loadouts demanded at least 35 minutes of careful work. From his position aboard Akagi, flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, Naito had watched American carriers through reconnaissance reports with growing confidence. The American doctrine seemed improvised, almost reckless. Their damage control teams ran instead of walked. Their ordnance crews appeared to work in overlapping shifts rather than the organized, sequential procedures Japanese carriers employed. Everything about their operations appeared hastily assembled, lacking the refined precision of Japanese naval tradition. He had documented these observations in 17 separate reports over the previous months, each one reinforcing his belief that American carriers, while numerous, could not match Japanese efficiency in the critical moments of engagement. On the other side of the tactical equation, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 3,000 meters, fuel gauge reading critically low, eyes scanning the empty ocean below for any sign of the Japanese carrier fleet. He had launched from USS Enterprise hours earlier with 32 other Dauntless bombers, expecting to find the enemy at the coordinates intelligence had provided. But the ocean stretched empty in every direction, a featureless expanse of blue that consumed fuel with every passing minute. His radio crackled with similar reports from other squadron leaders. Nobody could find the Japanese carriers. The carefully planned intercept had failed. Fuel was becoming critical. Some pilots would soon face the choice between ditching in the ocean or turning back with their bombs still loaded. McCluskey made a decision that would have seemed irrational by Japanese standards. Instead of following the rigid flight plan, he deviated based on intuition and a single piece of evidence: a lone Japanese destroyer cutting through the water below at high speed, its wake pointing northeast. Japanese doctrine would have demanded consultation with headquarters, verification of orders, confirmation of the new vector. McCluskey simply turned his entire squadron to follow that wake. He had been trained in an American system that valued initiative over procedure, individual judgment over collective certainty. The American Naval Aviation Program emphasized adaptability because American industrial capacity could replace lost aircraft. Japanese aviation emphasized precision because Japanese industrial capacity could not. Aboard Akagi, Naito received word at 09:15 hours that American aircraft had been detected approaching from the northeast. His stopwatch showed that Japanese carriers had been rearming their aircraft for exactly 47 minutes. According to his calculations, they needed at least 18 more minutes to complete current operations, clear the flight decks, and launch defensive patrols. He felt a calculated confidence. The Americans had arrived too early. They would be forced to attack while Japanese fighters were still launching, or they would have to circle overhead, burning fuel while waiting for an optimal attack position. Either option favored Japanese defenses. His timing data suggested the Americans had made a critical tactical error. What Naito could not see from his position was the American approach unfolding across multiple vectors simultaneously. Torpedo bombers from USS Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown were converging on the Japanese fleet from 3 different directions, not through coordinated planning, but through the chaos of individual squadron leaders making independent decisions after losing contact with their carriers. Japanese doctrine trained officers to view this kind of dispersal as a failure of command and control. American doctrine had accidentally created a multi-axis attack that would split Japanese defensive attention across the entire compass. Ensign George Gay, piloting a Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber from Hornet, descended to wave-top level with 7 other aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8. They had found the Japanese fleet almost by accident, following the same destroyer wake that had guided McCluskey. Gay could see the Japanese carriers now, massive vessels displacing over 36,000 tons each, their decks crowded with aircraft in various states of preparation. He could count at least 60 planes visible on Akagi's deck alone, some with wings folded, others being maneuvered into launch positions. The air around the carriers filled with black bursts of anti-aircraft fire, and above them he could see Japanese Zero fighters diving to intercept. The American torpedo attack that followed would have been judged a catastrophic failure by any measure of tactical efficiency. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers, 35 were shot down. Their torpedoes were too slow, running at only 33 knots compared to the 48-knot Japanese Type 93. Their approach altitude was too low, making them perfect targets for both anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. They attacked without fighter escort because American fighter doctrine had not yet adapted to the ranges required for carrier combat. By Japanese calculations, the attack should never have been attempted. It violated every principle of concentration of force and coordination that Japanese naval aviation held sacred. But Naito, still timing operations with his stopwatch, noticed something that made his hand pause mid-calculation. The American torpedo attack had forced every Japanese Zero fighter down to sea level to intercept the slow-moving bombers. The sky above the Japanese carriers, which should have been filled with defensive fighters at multiple altitudes, was now completely empty above 1,000 meters. He looked at his stopwatch again. The torpedo attack had lasted exactly 11 minutes. In that time, Japanese carriers had not completed rearming operations. Aircraft remained on the decks, some with fuel lines still attached, others with ordnance carts positioned alongside. The decks were full of planes that could not launch because the attack had interrupted preparation sequences. Then, at precisely 10:22 hours, McCluskey's dive bombers appeared at 4,000 meters, directly above the Japanese carriers, unopposed by any defensive fighters. Naito watched through binoculars as the American Dauntless bombers rolled into their dives, one after another, like a textbook demonstration of dive bombing technique. He could see the bombs release, tumbling through the air with lazy precision. In that moment, his 7 years of experience in carrier aviation allowed him to calculate exactly what would happen next. He could see the fuel lines on the deck. He could see the armed aircraft with bombs and torpedoes still loaded. He could see the ordnance carts filled with additional weapons. He understood with absolute clarity that the American attack timing was not accidental chaos, but something far more dangerous. The first bomb hit Akagi's flight deck at 10:24 hours, penetrating to the hangar deck below, where 17 fully fueled aircraft were being prepared for launch. The explosion touched off a chain reaction that Naito had been trained to prevent through careful procedure. Fuel ignited, ordnance cooked off. The hangar deck became an inferno. He watched his stopwatch automatically, noting that secondary explosions began exactly 43 seconds after the first impact. Everything he had calculated about rearming times, about procedural efficiency, about Japanese tactical superiority, collapsed into irrelevance in the face of a simple reality. American dive bombers had arrived at the exact moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, not through superior planning, but through a kind of organized chaos that Japanese doctrine had no framework to counter. On Kaga, 2 bombs struck within 20 seconds of each other, both detonating among aircraft being armed on the flight deck. Lieutenant Commander Amagai Takahisa, the ship's air officer, had been supervising rearming operations personally. He had written 3 technical manuals on efficient ordnance handling and had trained his crews to move with mechanical precision. His procedures were considered the finest in the combined fleet. He had timed every operation, eliminated every wasted movement, created a system of such refined efficiency that it could rearm an entire deck of aircraft faster than any other carrier in the Japanese Navy. All of that expertise became meaningless when American bombs struck aircraft carrying fully armed torpedoes. The resulting explosion lifted a section of the flight deck 3 meters into the air. Amagai survived the initial blast, but stood on a deck that was now a mass of twisted metal and burning aviation fuel, watching years of careful procedure dissolve into elemental chaos. Commander Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier and was considered one of Japan's finest aviation tacticians, stood on Akagi's bridge, watching 3 Japanese carriers burn simultaneously. He had calculated American industrial capacity, studied their training programs, analyzed their tactical doctrine. His intelligence reports showed that America was producing aircraft at a rate of approximately 4,000 planes per month across all types. Japan's production stood at approximately 250 aircraft per month. He had understood these numbers intellectually, but had believed that Japanese pilot quality and tactical precision would offset American numerical advantages. Now, watching his own carriers consumed by fire because American bombs had arrived at precisely the moment when Japanese procedural efficiency had created maximum vulnerability, he began to understand that industrial capacity was not just about numbers, it was about the ability to accept losses, to value adaptability over perfection, to train pilots to make individual decisions rather than execute predetermined plans. Aboard Enterprise, Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson was returning from his dive-bombing run when he saw 3 Japanese carriers burning below. His Dauntless had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire, his fuel gauge reading almost empty, his radio shot through. He had no way to know if the attack had succeeded until he saw the smoke columns rising from the Japanese fleet. He had been trained to fly in a system that accepted high loss rates as inevitable. American naval aviation schools were graduating approximately 500 new pilots per month, compared to Japan's 50. American doctrine assumed that many pilots would be lost, so training emphasized getting adequate numbers of adequately skilled aviators into combat quickly. Japanese doctrine assumed that every pilot was irreplaceable, so training emphasized creating perfect aviators through years of intensive preparation. Dickinson was not a perfect pilot by Japanese standards. He had completed his training in 18 months rather than 4 years. But he was good enough, and there were hundreds more like him in the pipeline. On the Japanese carrier Hiryu, the only carrier in the strike force that had not been hit in the initial American attack, Captain Tomeo Kaku watched his sister ships burning and made an immediate decision. His carrier's aircraft had completed rearming operations during the American attack on the other carriers. He had a strike force ready to launch. Japanese doctrine in this situation called for verification of orders from flagship command, coordination with remaining carriers, establishment of defensive positions. Kaku ignored all of it and ordered an immediate launch against the American carriers. His strike force of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters departed Hiryu's deck at 1100 hours, flying toward the American fleet with the kind of tactical perfection that Japanese training produced. They arrived at USS Yorktown at noon precisely, executed a textbook dive-bombing attack, and scored 3 direct hits that would eventually lead to the carrier's loss. Naito, who had evacuated Akagi as the fires spread beyond control, watched Hiryu strike from a rescue vessel. He timed the attack automatically, his stopwatch still clutched in his hand. 18 aircraft had struck an American carrier with devastating precision. It was the kind of attack Japanese doctrine predicted, the kind of tactical excellence Japanese training produced. And yet, even as he watched Yorktown list and burn, he understood with cold certainty that this single successful strike would not change the fundamental equation of the battle. Japan had 4 carriers burning. America had lost 1 carrier, but had 2 still operational. American industrial capacity would replace Yorktown with 2 new carriers within 8 months. Japanese industrial capacity could not replace Akagi for 2 years, if at all. The counterattack against Hiryu came at 500 hours that afternoon. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier and executed an attack that was, by Japanese tactical standards, sloppy and uncoordinated. Aircraft attacked from multiple angles without proper coordination. Some bombs missed by substantial margins. The attack pattern would have received failing marks at a Japanese naval academy. But 4 bombs hit Hiryu's deck, and 4 bombs were enough. Like her sister ships, Hiryu had aircraft being armed on deck. Like her sister ships, she carried aviation fuel and ordnance. Like her sister ships, she transformed from a functioning warship into a burning wreck within minutes. Captain Kaku stood on his bridge as fires spread through his ship and understood that Japanese tactical precision had been defeated not by superior American tactics, but by superior American capacity to absorb chaos and continue functioning. Ensign Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the Pacific Ocean for 30 hours before rescue, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. He had seen his entire squadron eliminated, 15 aircraft and 30 men lost in a single attack that achieved no direct hits. By Japanese tactical standards, Torpedo Squadron 8's attack was a complete failure. But Gay understood something that Japanese doctrine struggled to process. The torpedo attack had not been designed to sink carriers. It had been designed to disrupt Japanese defensive patterns, to pull fighters out of position, to create windows of vulnerability. It had succeeded perfectly, not through tactical excellence, but through tactical sacrifice. American doctrine could accept the loss of an entire squadron if it created opportunities for other forces to succeed. Japanese doctrine could not conceive of such deliberate expenditure of irreplaceable resources. Over the following hours, as Japanese destroyers pulled survivors from burning carriers, Naito interviewed dozens of officers and sailors. He collected their observations, timed their experiences, documented the sequence of events with the same meticulous precision he had applied to studying American rearming procedures. Every officer he interviewed described the same pattern. American forces had appeared disorganized, uncoordinated, almost chaotic. Their attacks had come from multiple directions without apparent central planning. Their tactics had violated Japanese principles of concentration and coordination. And yet through that apparent chaos, they had achieved perfect tactical timing, striking at precisely the moment when Japanese procedural excellence had created maximum vulnerability. A young pilot named Haruo Yoshino, rescued from Kaga, told Naito something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yoshino said he had been in his aircraft, waiting for launch clearance when American bombs struck the deck. He described watching American dive bombers attack while Japanese fighters were still climbing back to altitude after engaging the torpedo bombers. He said the American coordination seemed impossible unless it was planned. But the intelligence reports showed it could not have been planned because American squadrons had lost contact with each other and with their carriers. Then Yoshino said something that made Naito put down his stopwatch. He said that maybe American strength was not that they could plan better than Japan, but that they could function without planning at all. On June 5th, Admiral Nagumo's staff compiled damage reports aboard the cruiser Nagara, which had become the temporary flagship after Akagi's evacuation. 4 fleet carriers lost, 248 aircraft destroyed, 3,500 personnel lost, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and maintenance crews. The reports calculated that Japan's carrier force had been reduced by approximately 65% in a single day. American losses stood at 1 carrier, 145 aircraft, 300 personnel. By tactical measures, both sides had suffered significantly. By industrial measures, America had traded resources it could replace within months for Japanese resources that could not be replaced for years. Naito spent the return voyage to Japan analyzing his timing data, trying to understand where his calculations had failed. His numbers had been correct. American rearming procedures did take longer than Japanese procedures when measured in isolation. American tactical coordination was less precise than Japanese coordination when measured by doctrinal standards. But he had measured the wrong things. He had timed individual procedures without understanding that American doctrine was built around systemic redundancy rather than individual perfection. He had calculated efficiency without accounting for the fact that American industrial capacity made efficiency less important than volume. He had analyzed American chaos without recognizing that their chaos was a feature, not a flaw, of a system designed to function through individual initiative rather than central control. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the conflict would calculate that American shipyards produced 147 aircraft carriers of all types between 1941 and 1945, compared to Japan's 16. American aircraft production reached 96,000 planes in 1944 alone. Japanese production peaked at 28,000 planes in 1944. But these numbers only quantified what Naito had observed during that morning above Midway. American military doctrine was built on an industrial base that could sustain losses indefinitely. Japanese doctrine was built on tactical perfection because tactical perfection was the only force multiplier available to an industrial base that could not match American production. In the months following the engagement, Naito was reassigned to a training command where he was tasked with developing new tactical doctrines to counter American carrier operations. He spent hundreds of hours analyzing the battle, timing American procedures from recovered film footage, calculating optimal response patterns. His final report, submitted in November 1942, recommended fundamental changes to Japanese carrier operations. He suggested that Japan should adopt American-style initiative-based tactics, should accept higher loss rates in exchange for greater tactical flexibility, should redesign training programs to produce more pilots of adequate quality rather than fewer pilots of perfect quality. The report was noted, filed, and largely ignored. Japanese institutional culture could not easily adapt to doctrines that accepted imperfection and loss as systemic features. Years later, after the conflict ended, Naito worked as a technical consultant for the American occupation authorities, helping them understand Japanese naval thinking. An American naval historian named Samuel Eliot Morrison interviewed him extensively about the Midway engagement. Morrison asked Naito when he knew Japan would lose the conflict. Naito thought carefully before answering. He said he had known, intellectually, about American industrial advantages before Midway, but he had believed that Japanese tactical excellence and fighting spirit could offset those advantages. Then he described watching American dive bombers appear above the Japanese carriers at exactly the moment when Japanese procedural perfection had created maximum vulnerability. He described understanding that American forces had achieved perfect tactical timing, not through superior planning, but through the chaos of individual squadron leaders making independent decisions. He said that was the moment he understood that Japan was fighting a nation whose strength came not from doing things better, but from being able to do things badly, and still win through sheer volume and adaptability. The American officer conducting the interview asked Naito about his stopwatch, which he still carried. Naito explained that he had timed every significant naval operation he had observed during the conflict. He had hundreds of notebooks filled with timing data, calculations of efficiency, comparisons of procedures. The officer asked what all that data had taught him. Naito responded that it had taught him that what can be measured is not always what matters. He had measured procedure and found Japanese superiority. He had measured pilot quality and found Japanese superiority. He had measured tactical precision and found Japanese superiority. But he had not measured adaptability, industrial capacity, or the ability to function through chaos. Those were the factors that determined outcomes, and they were not easily reduced to stopwatch calculations. The young pilots being trained at American naval air stations in late 1942 received approximately 120 hours of flight training before being certified for carrier operations. Japanese pilots at the same time received approximately 700 hours of training. The American pilots were, by any objective measure, less skilled. But American doctrine did not require them to be as skilled, because American carriers could absorb losses and continue operating. American maintenance crews could repair damage faster because they had access to abundant spare parts and replacement equipment. American logistics could sustain operations at greater distances because American industrial production created surplus capacity that could be devoted to supply chains. Every aspect of American naval operations was built on an assumption of abundance that Japanese operations could not match. Commander Fuchida, recovering from injuries sustained during Akagi's evacuation, spent months in naval hospitals analyzing the battle. He had access to all intelligence reports, all tactical analyses, all captured American documents. He read everything available about American carrier doctrine, industrial capacity, training programs. His final report concluded that Japan had lost the engagement not through tactical errors, but through strategic impossibility. Japanese tactical excellence could not overcome American industrial capacity. Japanese pilot quality could not offset American pilot quantity. Japanese procedural efficiency could not compete with American adaptive chaos. He recommended that Japan seek a negotiated settlement before American industrial advantages became overwhelming. The report was classified and filed. Japan continued fighting for 3 more years. The carriers lost at Midway represented approximately 70% of Japanese fleet carrier construction from 1936 to 1942. Replacing them would have required diverting steel and industrial capacity from other critical war production. Japan attempted to replace the lost carriers by converting battleship hulls and accelerating new construction, but completed only 2 fleet carriers between Midway and the conflict's end in 1945. America completed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers in the same period, along with dozens of light carriers and escort carriers. The industrial disparity that Naito had observed through his timing calculations at Midway became increasingly impossible to ignore as the conflict progressed. By late 1944, Naito was training kamikaze pilots, young men with minimal flight hours who would make single one-way missions against American carriers. The tactical doctrine he taught them was designed around a simple calculation. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 carrier. It was a doctrine of perfect efficiency, born from absolute desperation. Each kamikaze pilot represented Japan's final attempt to use tactical precision to offset industrial disadvantage. Naito timed their training with his stopwatch, calculating optimal dive angles and approach speeds with the same meticulous care he had once applied to studying American rearming procedures. But he understood that he was teaching tactics of last resort to pilots who would not survive their first mission, fighting against a nation that could replace every carrier they struck, with 2 more within months. The final irony that Naito documented in his personal journal was that kamikaze tactics, which represented the ultimate expression of Japanese willingness to accept individual sacrifice for tactical advantage, were defeated by American industrial capacity to simply absorb the losses. American carriers struck by kamikaze attacks were repaired and returned to service. American damage control procedures, which had seemed chaotic and improvised compared to Japanese precision, proved remarkably effective at containing damage and maintaining operations. American medical facilities could treat hundreds of casualties and return crew members to duty. Even Japanese tactics of perfect sacrifice could not overcome American capacity to sustain imperfect operations indefinitely. When the conflict ended in August 1945, Naito still had his stopwatch. He had timed the entire Pacific conflict from Pearl Harbor to surrender, documenting with meticulous precision the collapse of Japanese tactical excellence under the weight of American industrial abundance. His notebooks contained thousands of calculations, timing analyses, efficiency measurements. All of them had been correct within their own framework. All of them had been fundamentally irrelevant to the conflict's outcome. He had measured what could be measured and found Japanese superiority. But superiority in measurable tactical efficiency meant nothing against an opponent whose doctrine embraced chaos and whose industrial base could sustain indefinite imperfection. The post-war analysis of the Midway engagement concluded that American forces had achieved victory through a combination of intelligence advantages, tactical fortune, and Japanese errors in judgment. These analyses focused on individual decisions, specific timing of attacks, particular tactical choices. Naito, reading these reports years later, found them both accurate and incomplete. Yes, American intelligence had provided advance warning of Japanese movements. Yes, tactical fortune had placed American dive bombers above Japanese carriers at the optimal moment. Yes, Japanese commanders had made choices that increased vulnerability. But beneath all these tactical factors lay a deeper strategic reality. America could afford to lose Midway and still win the conflict through industrial attrition. Japan could not afford to lose Midway and could not replace the lost carriers fast enough to maintain naval parity. The battle's outcome was determined as much by shipyards in Philadelphia and aircraft factories in California as by decisions made in the skies above the Pacific. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.